The night Petra Vance made the worst, and possibly best, decision of her life. It was 22 degrees in Detroit and falling. She had just finished her shift at Detroit Receiving Hospital, still wearing her scrubs under her coat, because the locker room heating had been broken for 6 days, and nobody from maintenance had shown up. The snow wasn't the pretty kind. It was the horizontal kind, the kind that got into your collar and your ears and found ways to make you feel personally targeted. Petra walked the 4 blocks from the bus stop to her apartment on Alexandrine Avenue with her head down, and her hands jammed into her pockets, and her thoughts already on the leftover soup she was going to reheat the moment she got inside. She almost didn't see him. He was wedged between her building's dumpster and the brick wall of the neighboring parking structure, slumped at an angle that looked deeply wrong. One arm draped over the lip of the dumpster like he'd been trying to pull himself up and simply run out of whatever was keeping him going. For a half second, Petra thought he was homeless, maybe drunk, and she felt the quick internal calculation every night shift nurse learns to make. Assess from a distance, don't touch, call 911. She'd done it before. It was protocol. Then she got closer and saw the blood. It was soaking through the left side of his jacket in a pattern she recognized immediately. She'd seen enough GSWs in the ER to know what that particular dark spreading stain meant. He'd been shot. Abdomen, maybe flank. He was still breathing. She could see the shallow rise and fall of his chest, barely, but breathing. She should have called 911 right then. She knew that. She would think about that decision for a long time afterward. The exact moment she chose not to reach for her phone, not to step back, not to let the system handle it. She still couldn't fully explain it, even to herself. Maybe it was the temperature. Maybe it was the way his face looked. Younger than she'd expected, somewhere in his mid-30s, dark stubble, a jaw that was set even unconscious, like he was used to holding things together through force of will. Maybe it was just the nurse in her, the part that had spent 6 years being trained to respond to the body in front of her and not the paperwork around it. "Hey," she crouched down. "Can you hear me?" He didn't respond. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat. Pulse rapid, thready, not good. She looked at the entry wound through the tear in his jacket. No exit wound visible on this side, which meant the bullet was still in there, which meant she couldn't do this in a parking lot. She looked up and down the alley. Empty. The snow was coming down hard enough now to muffle everything. Petra Vance, 29 years old, 4-year nursing degree from Wayne State, 2 years in the ER and 2 more in trauma recovery, made a decision that was going to change everything she thought she knew about her own life. She got him inside. It took 11 minutes and every ounce of upper body strength she had, because the man outweighed her by at least 80 pounds and was completely dead weight. She half carried, half dragged him through the building's side entrance, using the code she'd memorized, got him into the elevator, got him to the 2nd floor, and maneuvered him through her apartment door in a series of moves that she would later describe to herself as borderline humiliating for both of them. He hit her couch with a sound that rattled the lamp on her end table. She stood over him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went into nurse mode. She cut the jacket off him. It was already ruined, and got a better look at the wound. Entry point just below the left ribs lateral, which was either very good or very bad, depending on what it had nicked on the way in. The bleeding was significant, but not arterial, which was the only reason he was still alive. She had a first aid kit under the bathroom sink that was more substantial than most people's, because she was a nurse and old habits, and she went to work with gauze and pressure, and the kind of focused calm that she could only maintain by not thinking about anything beyond the immediate task. She packed the wound. She wrapped him tight. She got his temperature up with the space heater from her bedroom and 2 blankets she didn't care about anymore. She started an IV. She kept a small emergency supply, again, nurse, and got fluids running to stabilize his pressure. She did all of this with the precision of someone who had done versions of it hundreds of times, and she did not let herself think about who he was, or why he'd been shot, or what it meant that there was a stranger bleeding on her couch. She thought about those things later. Around 2 in the morning, when he was stable, and she was sitting on the coffee table across from him with a mug of black coffee she'd forgotten to drink. She thought about them a lot. His jacket was on the floor. She'd looked through it while working. Habit, checking for ID. She hadn't found a wallet. What she'd found was a phone with a cracked screen that was locked, and a folded piece of paper with a series of numbers that looked like coordinates, and on the inside lining of the jacket, stitched in thread so dark it was almost invisible, a symbol, a small crown above a serpent devouring its own tail. Petra knew that symbol. She'd grown up in Detroit. You learned certain things growing up in Detroit. The way you learned street names and bus routes, and which neighborhoods you didn't cut through after dark. The Crown and Serpent was the mark of the Morrow Syndicate, the organization that controlled the freight shipping through the port of Detroit, the private security contracts along the waterfront, and, if the stories were accurate, significant portions of the city's pharmaceutical distribution chain, legal and otherwise. The syndicate had been operating in Detroit for 40 years. They were so embedded in the city's infrastructure that people had stopped thinking of them as criminals and started thinking of them as a fact of life like potholes and lake-effect snow. The man bleeding on Petra's couch was not a random victim. He was one of them. She sat very still for a long time after she figured that out. The space heater hummed. Outside, the wind was doing something architectural to the loose aluminum on the neighboring roof. Petra looked at the man on her couch. Stable now, color slightly better, breathing deeper, and felt a fear that was different from anything the ER had ever given her. The ER fear was clean and purposeful. It had direction. This fear was shapeless. It sat in her chest and expanded. She could still call 911. She thought about that. She could call and say she'd found him in the alley. True, and that she'd brought him inside. True, and that she needed an ambulance. True. And then the police would come, and they would ask questions, and whoever had shot this man would find out where he'd spent the night, and then they would know where she lived. She put her phone face down on the coffee table. She refilled her coffee and she waited. He woke up at 6:15 in the morning, as the Detroit sky was beginning to lighten from black to a dark grey that didn't really count as dawn. Petra was in the armchair across the room with her knees pulled up to her chest, half asleep. The sound of him moving, a sharp intake of breath, then a low, controlled sound of pain that he seemed to be deliberately keeping quiet, snapped her fully awake. She watched him take in the room. It was a practiced scan, quick and systematic, starting at the ceiling and moving outward. He catalogued the exits before he catalogued her. She noticed that. "You're not going to be able to move much," she said before he could try. "You've got a bullet in your left flank. I've managed the bleeding and stabilized you, but you need surgery. There's no version of this where you don't need surgery." His eyes settled on her. They were dark, a deep grey-brown, the kind of color that looked almost black in low light. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, low, careful. "The person who found you in the alley." She kept her voice neutral, same tone she used with patients who were scared and didn't want to show it. "My name is Petra. I'm a trauma nurse." "How long?" "About 4.5 hours. Something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude exactly. More like reassessment. "You didn't call anyone?" "No. Why not?" Petra looked at him. "I found the jacket lining." A pause. "And you still didn't call?" "I'm still trying to decide if that was smart or catastrophically stupid." She set down her coffee mug. "I'm leaning toward the latter. But you were dying in 22-degree weather, so here we are." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him processing, running calculations behind those dark eyes. He moved his right hand slowly, and she watched it. He was checking for something at his hip. It wasn't there. She'd removed it when she'd undressed him enough to work on the wound. The gun was in her kitchen drawer, unloaded, with the magazine on the opposite counter. "It's in the kitchen," she said, unloaded. His jaw tightened. "I'm not going to use it," she said. "I just didn't want you bleeding out because you shifted wrong trying to reach for it. It's yours. You can have it back when you can walk." Another long pause. "My name is Declan Morrow," he said. The name hit her somewhere behind the sternum. She kept her face still, because 6 years of trauma nursing had made her very good at keeping her face still. But internally she was doing a very fast and not at all calm recalculation of her situation. Declan Morrow. The Morrow Syndicate didn't carry the family name coincidentally. They carried it because it was family. The Morrows had founded the organization and they still ran it, and the current operating head, she'd read his name in a Wayne County corruption story in the Free Press about 18 months ago, was a man named Declan Morrow, 41 years old, whose legitimate holdings included 3 shipping companies, a waterfront property development firm, and a controlling interest in 2 private freight terminals. The man who had bled on her couch for 4.5 hours while she worked on him was the head of the Morrow Syndicate. Okay, Petra said, because she was a woman who had once talked a patient through pulling a rebar out of their own thigh and had not flinched, and she was not going to flinch now. Do you want to tell me who shot you, or do you want to do that later? Later, he said. Fine. She stood up. I'm going to make you something to eat and I'm going to check your dressing. And then we're going to talk about the surgery you need, because I can manage what I've managed, but I can't take a bullet out of you with a first aid kit and a prayer. I have a doctor, he said. Of course you do. I need my phone. It's on the end table. Cracked screen, but it still works. I checked. He looked at her again with that same expression that wasn't quite anything she had a name for, like he was trying to figure out what category to put her in, and she didn't fit the ones he had. She went to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking slightly. She ran cold water over them until they stopped. By 9 in the morning, 3 things had happened that made Petra's understanding of what she'd gotten herself into significantly worse. The first was that Declan Morrow had made 2 phone calls on his cracked screen phone, both very short, both in a tone of voice that communicated he was in pain and furious about it in equal measure, but was not going to let either of those things show in his voice. She'd tried not to listen. She'd failed. The second was that her building's front door intercom buzzed, and when she answered it, the voice on the other end said only, "We're here for Mr. Morrow." And when she looked out her window, parked along Alexandrine Avenue in a line that stretched almost to the corner, were 47 black SUVs. 47. She counted. She had time because she stood at that window for a full 2 minutes without moving. The third thing was that Declan Morrow, who had propped himself up against her couch cushions, with the kind of effort that she could see was costing him enormously, looked at her face when she came back from the window and said, "They won't come inside unless I tell them to." "There are 47 cars on my street," Petra said. 48. Ralston Park's around the corner." She stared at him. "Mrs. Vance." Not softer exactly. Softer wasn't a word that seemed to belong near this man, but more deliberate, more direct. "You kept me alive last night. I'm aware of what that cost you in terms of risk and sleep and the general peace of your evening. Nothing that is parked outside is a threat to you. You have my word." "Your word," she repeated. "Yes. The word of the man who runs the organization that controls illegal pharmaceutical distribution through half of Wayne County." A pause, "among other things." Petra put both hands on the back of her armchair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She was 29 years old. She had student loans and a 7-year-old Honda Civic and a succulent on her windowsill named Gerald. She had not, at any point in her life, anticipated a situation involving 48 black SUVs and the statement, "among other things." "I need coffee," she said. "Can your people wait?" "They'll wait as long as I tell them to." She went back to the kitchen. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later. Dr. Osi, 50s, calm as still water, carrying a case that was clearly medical and not asking her any questions, which she appreciated. He examined Declan's wound with the thoroughness of someone who'd done this before and nodded once at Petra's work. "Clean," he said. "Good pressure packing." "You did this?" "Yes." "You're a nurse, trauma." He nodded again. Like this explained something. He gave Declan something for the pain. Petra noted it was not what she would have chosen, but it was a reasonable choice. And then they had a quiet conversation in the corner of her living room that she couldn't hear, And then Dr. Osi said he'd arrange transport within the hour. Petra went to sit at her kitchen table. She was still there when Declan appeared in the kitchen doorway. Upright, which he shouldn't have been, gripping the doorframe, which meant he was using the doorframe more than he wanted her to notice. "You shouldn't be standing," she said. "I know. Then why are you standing?" "Because I owe you an explanation." She looked at him. "You don't owe me anything. I'm a nurse. I saw someone who needed medical attention. And you correctly identified who I was and what that meant for your personal safety, and you stayed anyway." His voice was level, factual, almost. "That's not nothing." Petra was quiet for a moment. "Who shot you?" He was quiet for a moment. "A man who thought that removing me was the fastest way to take control of a contract I hold on the Zug Island terminal. He was wrong about several things. Is he going to be a problem?" Something in Declan's expression shifted, very slightly. Not for much longer. She didn't ask him to elaborate on that. "The people in those SUVs," she said, "they're going to know where I live now. They already did." When she looked up sharply, he continued, "Not because we were watching you. Because the moment I was reported missing last night, we pulled footage from every city camera within 6 blocks of where I went down. You appear on the Alexandrian camera at 11:47 p.m., assisting someone matching my description through a side entrance." A pause. "You're good at keeping your face neutral, but not that good." Petra absorbed this. "So you knew who I was before you told me your name?" "Yes, and you told me anyway. You'd already done the math on the jacket." He shifted his weight slightly. She could see the movement cost him. "And you hadn't called anyone. That told me something." "What did it tell you?" He looked at her for a moment. "That you make decisions based on what you see in front of you, rather than what you're afraid of. That's rarer than you'd think." She didn't know what to say to that. She looked down at her coffee mug. "We're going to leave within the hour," Declan said. "Dr. Osi has a facility." He paused. "Your address will be flagged in our system. Any alert originating from this location will receive immediate response." "That's not." She stopped. "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" "Yes. It's a little bit the opposite of reassuring. I know." Another pause. "It's the only thing I can offer right now that has practical value." She looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe because he had to, and he was holding himself very still because moving hurt, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not the calculation from before, something less managed than that. "The man who ordered the hit," she said. "His people don't know you were here. They know I disappeared. They don't know where." He paused. "We're going to keep it that way. How? That's not your problem to solve. It feels like it might become my problem if someone starts asking questions. If anyone asks, 'You were home all night.'" He met her eyes. "Which is true." She thought about that. It was true. She had been home all night. She had simply also been performing emergency trauma stabilization on the head of Detroit's most powerful criminal organization, while 48 SUVs eventually parked outside. But the baseline fact was accurate. "Fine," she said. She walked him back to the living room, or walked beside him while he refused to accept help, but also couldn't have made it without the wall. She checked his dressing one more time before Dr. Osi and 2 very large, very quiet men from the hallway. She hadn't heard them arrive, helped him toward the door. At the threshold, Declan stopped. He didn't turn all the way around, just enough. "Petra." She'd been using her first name with patience for 6 years. It still felt strange coming from him, like her name meant something different in his mouth. "Yeah, thank you." He said it simply. No elaboration, no qualifying it. Just the 2 words, flat and direct and more sincere than anything she would have expected from a man who controlled a criminal empire from behind a shipping manifest. She stood in her doorway and watched them go. Dr. Osi, the 2 quiet men, and Declan Morrow, who was 3 inches over 6 feet, and moved even injured with the deliberate, careful gravity of someone who had spent decades making sure he was the most dangerous person in any room he walked into. They went down the hall. She heard the elevator. She went back inside and closed the door. She sat on her couch, her couch, which was going to need professional cleaning at minimum and possibly replacement, and looked at the space where he'd been lying 6 hours ago. The blankets were still there. The IV stand she'd improvised from a floor lamp was still there. The first aid kit was open on the coffee table. Gerald the succulent was on the windowsill, unaffected by the night's events. Outside, she could hear the sound of engines, a lot of them, turning over in sequence and pulling away from the curb. She counted until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she picked up her phone and looked at it for a while. She had 4 hours before her next shift. She should sleep. She should absolutely sleep, and she should eat something. And she should probably have a very honest conversation with herself about every choice she'd made in the last 8 hours and whether any of them were defensible. She put the phone down. She looked at the door. She thought about the way he'd said her name. Just once. Just those 2 syllables. Like he was filing it somewhere careful. She thought about the 48 SUVs and the symbol on the jacket lining, and the thing he'd said about her making decisions based on what she saw rather than what she was afraid of. She thought about Dr. Osi nodding at her pressure packing, like she'd passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. She thought about the cracked phone on the end table, and the coordinates on the folded paper, and the man who had been dying in an alley in 22-degree weather, and had woken up 4.5 hours later in her apartment and started cataloguing exits before he'd looked at the person who'd saved his life. She thought about what it meant that she wasn't more afraid than she was. She was afraid. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She was afraid in the baseline practical way of a woman who understood exactly what she'd put herself adjacent to, and had enough situational intelligence to know that adjacency to people like Declan Morrow had historically not been without consequence. She knew that. She was sitting with it. She was also, and this was the part she had less framework for, something else. She didn't have a word for it yet. She'd figure it out. She had a shift in 4 hours, and student loans and Gerald to water, and approximately 43 things that were more urgent than trying to name a feeling she'd gotten from a man who was currently being transported to an underground medical facility in a convoy of SUVs. She'd figure it out later. She set an alarm, lay down on the far end of the couch, away from the bloodstain, which she was absolutely dealing with later, pulled the remaining clean blanket over her shoulders, and closed her eyes. Her phone buzzed once, not a call. A text from a number she didn't recognize and would never be able to trace. Your car has been serviced. Keys are under the left rear wheel. Consider the debt cleared, though I'm aware it isn't. Petra stared at the message for a long time. She looked at the door again. She thought, the debt isn't cleared. She thought, he knows that too. She put the phone down, and the city of Detroit turned grey and cold outside her window, and somewhere across the river, in a facility that didn't officially exist, a man with dark eyes and a bullet in his flank was making plans that she wasn't yet aware she was going to be part of. She fell asleep with the alarm set for 3 hours, and the strange, unexamined knowledge that whatever had started in that alley the night before had not, in any sense that mattered, finished.